Hello and welcome to the Summer Solstice episode of the Hadean Press podcast. Today I welcome the most brilliant Brian Johnson back to the show to discuss his involvement in the creation of our book, An Exposition upon the Sphere of the Cosmos, the Astrological Nigromancy of Cecco. To quote from his bio, Brian Johnson is an independent scholar, freelance editor, research consultant, and translator of historical documents pertaining to the occult. His work is largely concerned with reconstructing the esoteric worldviews and practices of historical individuals, based upon the study of primary source documents. Brian is the author of a number of important grimoire translations available through Hadean Press, such as Necromancy in the Medici Library, Testament of Solomon Recension C, and Naming the Heavens. Brian has also produced translations for both Cipriani Magici, authored with Jose Leto, and The Black Raven with Dr. Alexander Cummings. Brian has a ton of great essays published in various journals and has also recently published A Similitude of Nature, Giorgio Anselmi on the Images of the Eighth Celestial Sphere from An Press, which I highly recommend for people interested in medieval astrological image magic, which looks beyond the Bohemian stars and explores the magical potential of the wider cosmos. Brian and I have been working on an exposition of the sphere now for the past few years and are very excited to finally have the chance to share it with the wider community. As we are co-authors of this book, in this episode both Brian and I will be fielding questions to each other. We hope that you enjoy our conversation and consider supporting our work through Hadean Press. And with that, let the conversation begin. Brian, it's great to have you back. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Matt. It's always a pleasure.
So, Brian, in today's podcast, we are both going to be asking questions of each other, and I believe you have the first question.
Yes, turning the tables. You were the instigating force behind this project. So how did you first come upon this text by Cecco, and why did you think it was important?
So this would have been back in, I think, 2019, 2020, when I was researching my book, the Citation of Hygromantia. So I was reading through the routledge history of medieval magic after my friend Sharif recommended it to me. And I found mention of this obscure and ambiguously English astrologer monk named Johannes de Sacrobosco, aka John of Holywood, parentheses, or Halifax. And he was born in the late 12th century. So he's specifically famous for having written one of the most commented on treatises of natural philosophy in history, titled De Sphera Mundi. And De Sphera Mundi is essentially the baseline text upon which Cecco is commenting on or making his exposition on. But yeah, Johannes is probably now remembered most for his criticism of the Julian calendar, but the centuries after his equally ambiguous death saw his astrological manual on the nature of the cosmos being studied and commented on by a great number of natural philosophers all across Europe, many of whom wished to add their own thoughts, criticisms, and rationales to add to his work. And one of these commentaries and expositions in particular stood out to me. And these were the hitherto untranslated university lectures orated by the most infamous Italian heretic and nigromantic astrologer, Cecco. And so I did some reading on this character, on this historical character, Cecco, and I found that his work made reference to one of my primary interests, namely the four kings of the cardinal directions. And these specific spirits make an appearance in his lectures. I wasn't sure about the context or the reason that they were included, and I just really needed to know more about why they were included in there, and then what was the purpose of their inclusion in this text about essentially a natural philosophy text which predates most grimoires, as we have extant copies of. And what was their role in this? What was their function in this? And I think there's an overarching narrative in the European grimoires that includes these four kings specifically. And I wanted to sort of get to the core of this. Why is it important? Yeah, as I said, this is part of an ongoing project of mine. So I needed to complete this work, I think, before I felt like I could continue with my primary work. So this entire text was a sort of a side quest for another book that I'm writing. So I'm also really interested in medieval astrology and its influence on what we call magic today. And Cecco's lectures were focused on this subject, but also not so subtly, also about the art of nigromancy. And to be clear, there is a distinction between nigromancy and necromancy, in that necromancy can be specifically used as a term meaning to conjure or to divine via the shades of the dead, whereas nigromancy is, it literally just means black magic, and it's a far broader term. Over the centuries, however, necromancy has sort of supplanted this word and become a sort of catch-all for any type of illicit magic. So Cecco's work is specifically considered astrological nigromancy because it is black magic with a foundation in Aristotelian philosophy and Ptolemaic astrology. And those subjects combined produce this astrological nigromancy that is in the title of our book. I suppose as a background for people who might never have heard of Cecco, he was a lecturer at the University of Bologna at the very end of the 13th century, and his work predates the compilation of the Summa Sacra Magicae, as I mentioned earlier, which as a document is a really important milestone in the foundation of the European grimoire tradition, if we could call it that. It isn't the very beginning, though, because the Summa is itself built from a composite of earlier grimoires. We just struggle to access examples of texts from periods before this. So some exist. I know, for instance, Gal Sofar just recently presented a Hebrew manuscript of the Clavicula Solomonis, and I think that's pretty exciting. And I know David Rankin is working on a 13th century manuscript as well, which is really awesome. So it's just in many cases these texts they're not presented even as books. Sometimes they're like scrolls and written on parchment and that, but they also, they exist in fragments, or, as is probably mostly the case, they're bound up with other texts and not catalogued correctly, or even at all, and are languishing in some library somewhere awaiting for discovery. But Cecco's lectures, they give us a window into something that was quietly happening during that period of history, which is really important if you're interested in understanding the history of the grimoires and the history of the way in which magic itself, sorcery, was practiced in Europe during that period, and then throughout the rest of history, really, all the way up to the modern day. It's also really important because it's during this time that we saw this huge influx of Arabic materials entering Europe and being translated in Italy and in Spain. And this is way before the Renaissance as well, right? So most of the classic Greek works that we take for granted today were still a century or two in the future for Cecco. So he had limited access to what he was capable of drawing from, but I mean, he still was drawing on enough materials that he could recreate or be part of this movement, which was just attempting to put all these pieces of this jigsaw together and build this interpretation of astrological nigromancy, essentially. And it's at this time too that we see this huge swell of quote unquote hermetic materials, which are also almost entirely pseudepigraphic, meaning that they're spurious or they've been attributed to other authors, usually Hermes Trismegistus. And a lot of these texts as well, they're often quite earnest. They're not necessarily always, completely uh, fantastical. A lot of them are medical texts attributed to characters such as Galen or other famous Greek philosophers who were interested in medical treatments and that sort of, like I say, technology in a sense. And a lot of these texts are also attributed to other famous Greek and Arabic thinkers. And it's this material that contained the seed of influence, which would ultimately transform the grimoires. And I think it's really important to understand this period of history more so that we can untangle this Frankenstein's creature that is European magic.
Yeah, I think it's always worthwhile to investigate sources that might modify our assumptions about the origins or evolution of the fundamental concepts in any field of knowledge. And I think Cecco's commentary is definitely an example of that.
Yeah, before we hit the record button, Brian, we were talking about complexity, weren't we? And how in your text, recently published text, a similitude, we see a strata of astrological magic which goes beyond the fixed stars, right? And you just don't
Mhm.
see that sort of thing in modern magic, right? You don't see that sort of thing being uh, replicated in the modern day. So what you've worked on in your work of similitude and what you've offered to everybody is access to a whole new region of the night sky beyond the 15 stars. And this is a really early text, right? What century was this?
This was early 15th century.
Early 15th, right? So that gives us this amazing window into this extra strata, this extra layer of complexity, which we can find all the components of it that you've put out there through this work with forgive me, is it Giorgio Anselmi? And we
That's right.
can, yeah, and we can take that really old material and we can bring it back in to modify what we already know, what we've had access to for decades. And yeah, we're in this really awesome period of history now, with component or parts of the Summa Sacra Magicae translated and accessible to us, and like work like you've just been putting out as well. And we can begin to sort of work out why the rationales for what we find in later materials are there, and we can start to rebuild what we've lost, essentially, what's been forgotten or what's been streamlined out of the system, really.
Yeah, we can start to see how these systems were built in the first place.
Mm. So, like you said, I was the one who instigated it. I was working on this for a while, and then I approached you and asked if you would be interested in doing it. So, what were your thoughts when I came to you and said, "Hey, Brian, would you help me with this project?"
Yeah, so at the time I was vaguely familiar with who Cecco D'Ascoli was through secondary literature, like the same things you'd been reading, like the Cambridge or the Rutledge uh, Handbook of medieval magic. Um, but I only really knew that he had written a commentary on Sacrobosco's astronomy textbook, which became infamous because it apparently incorporated a bunch of ill-advised demonological speculation. Uh, but having been hidden behind what I like to call the Latin paywall for 700 years, it wasn't really clear to me what he had actually specifically said. So I was up for taking on the project just to satisfy my own curiosity, which is generally my criteria for taking the time to work on anything. Uh, Looking back, purely in terms of interesting reading material, it didn't disappoint.
I love that you call it the Latin paywall because
Yeah.
that was essentially like my own immediate obstacle when I encountered Cecco's work, and a big part of why I wanted to make this text accessible to everybody in English in the first place. I had to translate the whole thing line by line with crappy Google Translate back in 2019. I was working from this website which I just can't find now. I don't know what website I was using, but it was a HTML based website that had all of Cecco's work and his poetry all written out in the original Latin. And the website, I don't know what was wrong with it, but I couldn't just copy and paste the entire chunk and work with it that way. I had to do it line by line, and I couldn't find another source where I could do this easier. Like there was no other way for me to do it at the time. So it took forever. It took forever for me to do it. Um, but yeah, I was really happy for it at the end because sort of line by line, I was, even though the translation was awful, you know, it was nothing like what you've accomplished with it. It had none of the subtlety, it had none of the complexity that you've sort of brought to the fore with your translation. But line by line, I felt like privy to something that only scholars had access to for centuries, and I was just really happy when you agreed to do the translation work with me and work on the project with me. So yeah, Brian, thank you, man. Dream come true.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I do this, to make this kind of material available to as many people as possible.
Right, right. Actually, was it on? I think we were in the middle of working on this when Justin Sledge of Esoterica on YouTube made an entire video about it and was like, "Oh, it's never been translated into English," and I was like, "Ha, not yet. I'm working on it." I had to keep my mouth closed as well back then because I was like it was still so fresh. We'd only just begun, or I was working on it at the time, and I was like, yeah, I kind of want to keep this quiet for now before other people jump on it, but at least I've got the head start. But it looks like nobody else took it up, so very happy that things worked out that way. Um, yeah, so staying on the same theme as with your work and translation, what were your biggest challenges when you approached this text, and did anything in particular surprise you?
I think the biggest challenge was the actual format in which the text is presented in the original Latin, because this is not a textbook. These are literally Cecco's lecture notes, apparently written nearly verbatim as he would deliver them in the classroom. So while they aren't grammatically very complicated, there are a lot of the kind of elisions and like omissions that you encounter in casual speech, where Cecco is like implicitly directing the students to refer to a passage or a diagram in Sacrobosco's book, or where he would otherwise fill in some gap. So that was something that I kind of had to look out for and fill in those gaps myself when the text would not make any sense otherwise. And readers will be able to see where I've done this as anything that's not strictly derived from the original Latin, I've put inside square brackets.
Mm. Yeah, you've done a really good job delineating exactly how we interpret specific things as well. Yeah, I was really impressed by your work on that. Yeah, it can be a challenge sometimes to follow along with Cecco because yeah, in effect, we're really reading two books at the same time, right?
Yeah.
While we're going through his lectures, we're trying to find uh well, because we're reading through Sacrobosco's text at the same time, really. He quotes heavily from Sacrobosco and then adds his own material on as he continues with his lectures. But yeah, trying to find suitable locations for a lot of the images that he's talking about as well, which I took directly from Disfera Mundi and incorporated into the text from Sacrobosco's work. I tried my best to put them in where it seemed like they made the most sense. So I hope that I hope the readers can uh, gain a little extra insight, as it were, from what's being said by the with the diagrams which are included. They're mostly images of celestial objects in relation to the Earth and the mathematical structures of astrology and astronomy that exist around the Earth as well in relation to the cosmos. And actually, I should say as well, like during this period, Brian, astronomy and astrology are essentially the same subject, right?
Yeah, I would say they were considered the same field. Yeah.
And could you add just a little extra about the cultural reason that one would study this subject? Why were people interested in this in general during the medieval period?
I think the most common let's say we call it the most common licit reason people would study it is medicine. You like any practicing physician would be expected to know the proper, astrological times to perform certain types of treatments or operations. I mean, that would be the most probably culturally accepted reason that people would seriously study astrology.
Mm. And Cecco's own father was a renowned doctor, I believe, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that would certainly track.
Yeah, so he came from a background of astrological medicine, yeah, and then yeah, at some point he took a bit of a left turn while he became a professor, and he's learned some rather dubious or some rather nefarious information along the way, which he's now decided to not so subtly teach his classroom.
Yeah, come to
um,
think of it, it's actually kind of rare to come across a physician who displays this kind of interest in called demonological subjects. Like
mm,
he was not a divinity professor.
mhm, right, exactly. So it's very practical what he's trying to explain as well. Um,
Yeah.
but it has we'll get into it as we go through the interview. But yeah, he has a lot of practical concerns about the body and about the spiritual creatures that exist within the air below the moon and how they influence the human body specifically. But yeah, going back to your going back to your work, a similitude. Uh, Given the subject of that text and another text which you're working on right now, which I think we'll keep secret for now, um, I'd love to know more about your opinions on the subject of medieval natural philosophy in general. I mean, I just asked you um, about astrology in particular, but I'd like to make it a little bit broader. So, medieval natural philosophy as a subject, which includes astronomy, astrology itself, anyway, and medicine and a bunch of other fields of study. What do you think that natural philosophy as a concept has to offer us today in the 21st century?
I think what strikes me about medieval natural philosophy generally, and especially its astronomy slash astrology, like we see with Cecco or Giorgio Anselmi, um, is the extent to which the cosmos itself is very mechanistic, and like virtually all natural phenomena are conceived of as the operations and interactions of physical substances. But at the same time, the universe is inhabited by this whole mostly invisible ecosystem of other intelligent beings, angels, fallen angels, maybe not quite fallen angels, um, who are also interacting with it and using it and its materials for their own purposes, all ultimately at the consent of some divine authority, but basically just like humans do. Uh, and I think one reason Cecco's text is interesting is because in his discussions of the various demons inhabiting the sublunar atmosphere, for instance, he shows that this kind of quasi-animist worldview could actually have some pretty unsettling implications for humans at least, like the threat of nocturnal assault by an incubus. You didn't have to go out looking to make some kind of a Faustian pact to end up on the wrong side of one of these guys. They'd come looking for you.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually something that I think we might actually talk about this a bit later, but this is a really ancient concern for people, right? This isn't
Yeah.
something new to Europe. It might have been imported into Europe from the East, from Arabic sources, and sort of reintroduced. But I think this is, like we said, it's one of the many concerns throughout the text that Cecco has, and he goes into great detail of the various habitations of demons within the aerial realm, and he also makes some other really sinister conclusions, many of which would have gotten him into a lot of trouble with the Inquisition. But yeah, and I think another thing that he touches on, which I think was common knowledge, was this idea of the various terrestrial habitations of the Earth, and he sort of he makes comment at some point about the very flesh and blood monstrous creatures that exist on the equator or below the equator. And I think in geographical terms, this is what we would call like Libya now. And I think like the ancient Greeks had very similar ideas about monsters and creatures that lived in these climates that were so extreme that normal humans couldn't, supposedly, quote unquote, couldn't live there. They did. It was populated by humans at the time. It's just the Greeks had this very particular understanding of the way in which these climes functioned. But yeah, I just it's an entire cosmology. It's an entire worldview. Which, yeah, largely today we can look at and be like, well, they were clearly wrong about almost all of it. But it's the for me, it's the magical implications, or the sorcerous way in which we can implement a lot of this into our work today. For instance, we don't have to actually believe that the Earth is at the center of the cosmos. It's not. We orbit the sun, of course, but from a specific point of view, while you're working magic, it makes sense to have like a geocentric cosmology. As long as you remember, it's just a map, right? And the map is not the territory. It's a blueprint in which we can create a systematized process of sorcery, which I think is really interesting, and it allows us to, as we mentioned before, I think we hit the record button, access specific regions of the cosmos. But yeah, as you mentioned as well, like the idea of incubi and succubi and nocturnal emissions and these spirits coming for us. Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think most Europeans may have been very concerned about those sort of things if it was their soul is under threat in a sense.
Yeah, yeah.
There's this idea that maybe they have to go and repent for it, or they have to uh there's some sort of spiritual attack which has occurred to them. So having understanding and having a knowledge about how to approach or to negate the assault of an incubus or a succubus is really important, not only to the physical body but also to the soul. So really important um, during his day. I think that's really important. But yeah, um, so you begin your text, A Similitude, discussing the Arabic influences on medieval Europe, and specifically in Giorgio Anselmi's work. And despite how obvious this might appear to us today, I think it's taken decades for people to really catch on to this influence, which has appeared, which stems from Islamic sources. But why do you think that that's the case?
So yeah, I did find that Anselmi in the astromagical part of his opus uh, borrowed a number of descriptions of astrological images from sources which apparently share a common origin with parts of both the Picatrix and a pseudo-Ptolemaic text called On the Images of the Faces of the Signs, both of which are Latin translations based on Arabic originals. Uh, Also, the names that he gives to many of the constellations, which lie outside of the zodiac, are just they're called calques. They're literal word for word Latin translations of their traditional Arabic names, um, which I suspect probably crept into Latin usage through interpolations made in earlier Arabic versions of Ptolemy's book, the Almagest, with its big star catalog, because those Arabic versions were the models used to produce the first Latin translations of it. Uh, as to why the Arabic connection in the history of science is not more widely recognized today, um, my impression has been that, at least among scholars of related subjects, this it's not really news. There's been discussion of the Arabic influence on medieval European science via the 12th and 13th century translation activity, especially in Spain, since the early 20th century at least. And at the same time, as you mentioned, uh, there's been some very recent scholarship by researchers like Gal Sofer at Ben Gurion University, which is beginning to kind of nuance our understanding of just how direct or not that influence may have been in various fields of knowledge. Um, as for how long it's taken this understanding to filter into popular culture, I think there are some major obstacles. For one thing, most people, even well-educated people, have virtually no exposure to science and technology as specifically historical topics, beyond maybe learning about Copernicus and Galileo in elementary school. So most people don't really have much frame of reference for even thinking about when and where new scientific ideas came from. And add to that the systemic xenophobia, which has informed Western perceptions of the Islamic world for literally hundreds of years now, and that leaves us where we
Mm,
are.
yeah, yeah, which is a terrible shame. And yeah, and you make a good point there as well about this being science. So when we say natural philosophy, we are really talking about early modern science, and which included a lot of subjects that today we wouldn't put under that umbrella term, right?
Yeah, and I'm being anachronistic calling it science. They were not using the scientific method as we know it,
Mm,
but I'm referring to study of the physical cosmos and how it works.
mm, yeah, fantastic point. Fantastic point. And there's so much more I could talk about this idea as well, about what natural philosophy really is as well. Going back to your point about Galsifer, I'm three-quarters of the way through his book on Solomonic magic, and I'm really enjoying it. There's the idea of or his proposed concept of not just being strictly linear in the way that we interpret the way in which texts are transmitted, but like how do I put it? Like drawing from a vast well of various different cultural touching points and sampling each small component to build entire pictures of build entire texts. Yeah, it's a really fascinating contribution to the way in which we interpret the way that this information is progresses through history. Yeah, what's your take on Gal's work?
I suggested. I think it's especially interesting the evidence that the direction of transmission of some of these specifically elements of Solomonic magic isn't necessarily what we've thought it had been for a generation or so. That
Mm.
uh, it wasn't necessarily as much of it wasn't necessarily going from uh, Arabic to Latin or Hebrew to Latin as we thought it may have been. There's evidence that there were translations from Latin into Hebrew, for example.
So it goes back and forth, right? It's a big soup.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and when you think about it in that way, I mean, of course, it makes sense. Like, and there's centuries of time in which these things were occurring, so it's going back and forth and translated, retranslated, and yeah, and the way that he breaks it up into the specific components that are being transmitted into genes. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, what's it? Phylogenetics, right? Sounds really complicated, but like he writes really well. So I'm looking forward to reading his other one. Is it Conjuring the Arab Magician? And the other one I want to read by him, which I'm not sure if it's published or not, but it's an essay at least that's published, not a book. But Wearing God is another one that I want to read by him, which is very something fascinating to me, which is I think is focusing on the idea of names being attributed to specific parts of the body and particular medicine or like quote unquote science of medicine from the perspective of natural philosophy.
That last essay you mentioned, I believe it deals specifically a lot with the Summa Sacra Magicae and the use of names in that.
Attributed to the areas of the body, right, and the
Yes.
vestments. Yeah, yeah, I'm interested to learn more about that. So it's on my ever growing to read list. What you said prior, you make some really excellent points that I'd like to add to as well. Like the when we're considering this influence which is being transmitted into Europe, we find like the entire foundation of what we call science today in the modern world has these significant roots in the ninth century Abbasid Caliphate, specifically from the House of Wisdom, which was founded in Baghdad. So we get sciences like optics, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. All of these subjects were then piece by piece, text by text, slowly imported into Central Europe after these huge translation efforts. I think, is it the 10th century in Spain? I think into Castilian. There's a massive work in northern Italy. All of these texts being translated, even right up until Agrippa's day. These texts are still being translated, and we're still gaining access to these materials. But granted, it's far slower now. Like it's not every day that you get a new work of Plato or Aristotle or something. But back then, they were pretty. It was pretty big news when these texts were finally being translated into languages people could read, and then eventually, all of this information in Europe reaches this breaking point, and that's what we call like the Renaissance. Essentially, this is where all of this information finally sort of cohered in such a way that European culture was just forever changed. And from that, we now have the modern scientific method, and we have all of the other fantastic things that occurred in the European Renaissance. But we should always make sure that we remember that a Renaissance in Europe is dependent on the Renaissance that happened in Baghdad in the 9th century. So it happens in waves. Yeah, and then finally, your last point, which was to xenophobia, essentially. Yeah, it's just the most backwards, ignorant position that we can take in any situation. But in this specific case, I mean, we just owe so much to early Islamic scholars, philosophers, and translators. It's such a shame that people still have quite bigoted opinions about this. But that said, there is a lot of nuance, specifically in the texts themselves, which were coming into Europe as well, and we go into that a lot in the book. Regarding these quote unquote hermetic texts, which were streaming into Europe in the 12th through the 14th century. But yeah, one text, one book, which is available to us today, which I highly recommend people check out if they're listening and they're interested in this subject, is Liana Saif's the Arabic Influences on Early Modern Occult Philosophy, and that was published in 2015, I think. It's a really great broad overview of the subject, and it focuses specifically on characters from and around the Renaissance and the particular influences that were applying to these characters from Arabic sources. So it's really worth getting that text and having a good read of it to like sort of get a really good foundation of knowledge about this subject. I really couldn't recommend that any higher. But Brian, do you have any books that you would specifically recommend on this subject for those that are curious?
Yeah, and I agree that Saif's work is probably the best place to start for looking at like the occult sciences specifically. Um, One other I'll mention is the title is Greek Thought, Arabic Culture by Dimitri Gutis. That's a really good source for understanding that earlier 8th to 10th century translation of Greek text into Arabic, which you were talking about, which kind of helps set the stage for the cultural efflorescence, which would produce much of what ended up being translated later on from Arabic into Latin. Yeah, there's also Juan Wadando Alegre's. It's called "The Spanish Hermes and Wisdom Traditions in Medieval Iberia," um, which is it's a very focused case study showing how I guess you'd say the methods of Arabic historiography, so history writing, um, including, as the title suggests, writings about Hermes Trismegistus and in various legends, and also pedagogical methods were kind of adapted by King Alfonso X of Castile in his attempt to try and shape the culture and the self-perception of the ruling elite of his kingdom in the 13th century.
Mm, yeah, Alfonso X of Carlisle is a really cool character, really interesting historical character, and I think doesn't the Picatrix come through his translation efforts?
I believe so.
All of the scholars and that he got together to complete this translation effort, which was decades in the making, really radically transformed the way in which astrology, astronomy, and ultimately magic is perceived and understood in Europe. And he's a really interesting character. But yes, there are some other books that I would really love to recommend on this subject. Let's see, I have Sorcery or Science by Marcus Sells, which I believe is from Penn State Press. And then we have The Arabic Hermes by Bladel, which is a really interesting, really fascinating text on this subject. And then we have like the very classic grimoire, The Son of Knowledge by Inloez and Hamade. And that text itself was profoundly influential on Western, I say quote unquote Western European uh, grimoire materials and the way in which we work sorcery uh, with the stars. It's very, very, very interesting work that I highly recommend. And then recently, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. I think I might be, but Bunja Rasik, who has been putting out some really, really good work. She's put out three books in the last couple of years. The Night Folk, which is a really cool look at I want to say like ancient jinn practices or like the other world in early Arabic thought or early Islamic thought. And then we've got bedeviled jinn doppelgangers in Islam and Akbarian Sufism. And her most recent publication is Azrael, Encounters with the Angel of Death in Islamic Thought and Culture. Yeah, so right now we're really quite spoiled for material on this subject, and there's a lot more coming to light. But other than those more modern texts, I think there is an absolute wealth of source material that I really recommend people read, specifically like Al-Kindi, Al-Biruni. I could go on and on and on. There's so many different texts, and we highlight as many as we can through our book on Cecco Diascoli on where he's found this information. And I try my absolute best to collate all of that information. But we'll get onto that in a bit. But yeah, Brian, next question for you. Cecco loves to quote from sources which are often, let's say, dubious. Uh, there are a few specific quotes which come to mind where he puts words into Aristotle's mouth. There's another one which really had me scratching my head for weeks and weeks and weeks trying to work out what it was, but he makes a quote from the book of Job from the Bible, and it's just wildly off, misremembered, or I don't know, perhaps this could be this could be an example of his diabolical attempt to invert scripture in some ways. It's very strange. But yeah, so his students, though, that he would have been listening to his lectures, they they surely would have been familiar with these sources. They must have read them over and over again. They would have had access to these in libraries. They would have known these quotes. They would have read this material. So what are your thoughts on Cecco's style? And do you think that he was being genuine when he makes these quotes?
Yeah, some of these quotes, I felt like I was being gaslighted from 700 years in the past because I was like, is my translation that far off? What is going on here? Because it's like I could recognize the source that he was pulling it from, but it just didn't match up. Um, so it's hard to answer this because we can't really know what was actually in Cecco's library. Uh, the unknown titles he cites, and his, at best heavily paraphrased quotations, uh, could be due to a number of different factors. Like on the textual side, he could have been reading works that we do know today, only transmitted under different titles, or they could have been paraphrases of works that we know, but that were, given titles as if they were not paraphrases, as if they were the full text. Or they could be unknown works which really are, currently lost to us. Um, on the other hand, I think that medieval citation practice, uh, to some extent, was driven more by an ethos of appealing to authority rather than being precisely accurate. So, in Cecco's mind, when he's, imparting some bit of knowledge that he knows he read somewhere, even if he isn't quite sure what the source was, he could, uh, justifiably feel confident in citing an author whom he believes at least fits the genre that he's discussing. So, um, and this was probably even more more the case in the context of a classroom lecture than it would have been if he had been, writing a text that he expected to be closely scrutinized and, cross-checked by readers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, could you imagine today taking uh, a course on classics and your teacher just wildly misquotes Plato, and then just with the absolute most most arrogant confidence just tells you that his quote is correct, and you're just like you're looking at the book like I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
think
but
that's
that,
right.
that that's just it. Cecco's students wouldn't have had the book to check.
Mm. Ah, right,
At
right.
least not easily.
Not easily. I see. So I was just I'm imagining that they would have been familiar with the Bible and they would have been familiar with Aristotle. They must have known at least in part that these quotes were um wildly off. But yeah, okay. All right. So they might not necessarily have had that immediate access that he had, but it's still just this I mean, for those people who get to read it, you'll see the sometimes his arrogance in the way that he speaks to his audience is really palpable, right? He has a very specific manner of in which he speaks. But yeah, to your point about the ethos in general of the appeal to authority, I just thought I would like to add a little extra about that. The appeal to authority is sort of a scholastic tradition, right? It's the you don't necessarily uh, make a claim to something the medieval style of practice, at least. You don't make a claim to something yourself. You sort of attribute somebody from history with the authority of the claim, and that gives it weight, right? So it's this idea of the we were closer to the truth in ancient times. And I think this sort of permeates medieval thought. So we have this idea, for instance, that Hermes Trismegistus was this wellspring of knowledge. And even though he was a pagan, Christians still sort of give him a pass, right?
Hmm.
Isn't he like, doesn't he become later on in the Renaissance? Don't they end up like attributing him to being the teacher of, is it Moses? Is it Abraham? I forget where they place him in history. Um,
Yeah, I think there are legends to that effect.
Yeah, so he ends up Jesus Christ being ends up being downstream of the wisdom of Hermes. So it's sort of given this a whitewashing, a coat, oh, it's not that pagan, they make it acceptable to modern Christianity essentially. But yeah, we see the same appeal to authority in the grimoire tradition. So we will see grimoires being attributed to Solomon, for instance, even though they're absolutely not attributed, they're not actually written by the King Solomon. They are attributed to King Solomon as a means of giving or lending authority to the text. So yeah, we see that same rationale playing out in the classroom with Cecco in with his students. So the way he makes his arguments are often based on, well, this famous person from history said this thing, right? And then he'll quote the incipit from the book from which he's citing or something, hopefully correctly.
Mm.
But yeah, it's it is really interesting. I had exactly the same feeling that you did, that I was being gaslit. I was like, no, I'm reading Aristotle. I'm reading it. I'm reading the section that you said that this is from, and I can't find it.
Yeah.
So it was very difficult to put it all together, but it was fun. And most of all, I mean, this gave me a really good opportunity to go back and like read all of these texts that informed this way of thinking. So writing this book has been an incredible education for me. But yes, Brian, I think you have the next question.
Yeah, so speaking of his citation practices, you say in your introduction to our book, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, quote, many of the titles presented to the reader simply cannot be found in the modern day if they ever existed at all. Uh, So, in your opinion, are Cecco's unknown sources just books that are now lost, or possibly ones circulating under titles different from those that have since been established by modern editors, or was he inventing titles to give his assertions the weight of authority? Or alternatively, how much of his obscurity is due to him willfully concealing sources that he knew would be considered illicit?
This is a really good question. And we've kind of touched a bit on it already. But yeah, as for willfully concealing sources, I think it's certainly likely. It would account for the mismatch between incipits and authors. There's also some quotes from the Bible and from Aristotle, like we've mentioned already, that everyone, I think, and well, I think I had thought most people in his lectures would have had access to, and they probably would have known. Um, and yet he still misquotes them completely. Even if they hadn't have known, they would have eventually gotten their hands on the text from the library at the School of Bologna, and they would have been able to check it out. So how much of this information was transmitted purely or orally through the teacher to the student? I'm not so sure on that specifically, but was this done on purpose though? Or was it the concealing done on purpose? We would need more evidence to ever make a really solid argument for it. But given what we know about the man, his interests, and I think the political climate of his era, it seems like a kind of a logical conclusion to make. On the other hand, we know that Cecco is absolutely citing from illicit sources, especially from pseudo-hipparchic sources. There's an entire corpus of pseudo-hipparchic texts which he quotes from, which none of which I can find anymore. I can't find any evidence of this entire corpus of knowledge. Maybe some of it has transformed, or it's been reattributed to Solomon in some way, or it's been reattributed in some other way. I can't find any evidence though. There's one specific text in this hipparchic corpus though called On the Hierarchies of Spirits. And when you read the incipits and you read the quotes, which I've lifted all of the quotes that he makes from this text, and I've put them all together in a linear fashion at the back of the book in one of the appendices, so you can read it, and it sort of reconstitutes or attempts to reconstitute a lost text. It's not much, but it's enough that we can hold on to that and say that we have something. But this text on the hierarchies of spirits sounds an awful lot like a far more famous text that we're very familiar with today called On the Book of the Offices of Spirits. And in these cases, he isn't bashful about stating this source. He's not shy about it. He quite openly admits to where he's quoting this material from, which is incredibly, it's pure nigromancy in a sense. So it's weird that he would openly declare he was citing works from a source of forbidden black magic, but then at the same time make a point from Aristotle about the nature of the planets that just doesn't exist, or misquote or even invert a quote from the Bible. So I think a lot of titles of these texts have changed in the past 700 years since Cecco, and now yeah, for sure that a lot of these texts they go by different titles now. As I said earlier as well, in many cases we don't necessarily lose these texts entirely. They just get bound up with other collections of more famous works as appendices, and they end up in libraries only, and maybe the title is recorded of the main text, but not the appendices text or the small text which are attached to them. And I think you have a lot of experience with that with the Medici library, right? Like there's a lot of texts in similar vein that were all wrapped up in that library of work.
Yeah, absolutely. the segment of the Codex. I'm forgetting the shelf mark now. Yeah, the book from the um, Medici Library that I translated a segment of. It is recorded as being the title is Fasciculus Rerum Geomanticarum. So it's putatively a book about geomancy. There are about 5 pages of geomancy out of some 700 in that entire book.
Brilliant. And then the rest of it.
Just all kinds of other things, mostly demonological magic.
And that's a really good point. Like a lot of these texts of demonological magic might have survived extant, like survived as objects, as books, because of that. Because the title was something as, I mean, geomancy, you have to remember, was a common practice from everybody. It
Oh yeah.
wasn't. It wasn't a hidden occult practice. It was a commonly used technique that it was widely understood and known by everybody. So like having an innocuous title might have been a good, might have been the reason why these texts survived and weren't, destroyed by the church or any other antagonistic group of people who might not have liked such a text existing in their library. But yeah, so exactly. So all about this subject. But yeah, there might still, a lot of these texts might still just be out there. They've just never been, the library hasn't been searched properly. Nobody's thought, I'm going to go and have a look in this specific library in Europe, in Italy or wherever, and I'm going to go through every single tiny little, what do you call them? The little cards that you have all like locked up in cabinets that like catalog these vast collections of works. And on top of that, you've also got private libraries which might never admit to what they have. They're just there existing, and even those people might not know what they have access to. They're just there waiting to be found. But then you also have to consider that during Cecco's day, it was sort of a free for all, in a way that there wasn't much standardization in translation. There was a lot of translation work happening, and to one to different various degrees, right? So there might have been, like, for instance, we mentioned before, like King Alfonso X, who would have been hiring like really professional scribes to do that work. And then in those cases where those manuscripts exist today, where we still have access to, subsequent copies of them, we can be fairly confident in the content and that they were accurately translated to a good degree. But then you also have like university settings where there are scholars and people making translations of spurious texts, like these pseudo hermetic texts and things that might just never have survived, or they might have been really badly translated, right? They're like just passionate lay people, not necessarily scholars, kind of like me and you, who are just doing it because of the sheer fun of doing it. Not to say
Yeah,
that
and
our translation isn't fantastic. It is. It's but back then there was no specific how do I say, like, regulation or anything on how this was done.
yeah, and not even just translations. I mean, the transmission of text within the same language. Things get cut up and excerpted because people are making copies of these texts for their own purposes. So they're copying the parts that matter to them. So, things get left out, things get remixed together and confused. Uh, so yeah.
Yeah, and we see exactly that happen with the Summa Sacra Magicae, right? We see all of these various components going into its construction. So we know that it's like part of it is derived from, like, or is extracted from like the Sworn Book of Honorius, or at least a recension of it, right? And all these other, like all these other grimoires, which existed at the time, but we just don't have access to now, or very limited access to at most, because almost none of them survive to the modern day. But they survive in the Summa. And then the Summa is like, I mean, I should be really clear here. The Summa isn't specifically like a grimoire in the sense of a grimoire that we might like, like the Ars Goetia or like the Grimorium Verum or something like that. The Summa Sacra Magicae is a summa, right? It's an entire cosmology, right? Pulled from, like with various information pulled from all over the from every angle that could possibly be covered, and it creates an entire finely tuned clockwork cosmos, right? Complete cosmos that is, and then that goes out into the world, and then we find that sections of that are pulled out and streamlined and go on to inform or even become individual streams of what we call the grimoires today. So yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating process to see how this is occurring over history. But to your final point, was Cecco just making things up? Yeah, probably. um, there are a few instances where we both got absolutely stumped, right? We were both just like, I have no idea what this bit means, right?
Yeah, repeatedly.
And a few times we both found multiple possibilities, but even then there was some level of ambiguity to it, right? And I think what I've tried to do with the footnotes of this book is to present as much information and background information and context that while you're reading the book, you can understand what's being said through the context that I'm trying to give. And oftentimes, this context might not always be perfectly representative of what Cecco is saying, but it does give you a window into what he might be getting at, right? So I think one example we had, one of the last things that we dealt with was this character named Moses the Arab, and he's quoted. He makes one specific quote about him, right? Every species in the world has a star looking upon and preserving it in its essence, which is a really cool astral nigromantic point that he makes. And this Moses, the Arab, he has two sons that we're aware of. One of these Moseses that we found has two sons who were very prominent astrologers in the 9th century Abbasid Caliphate at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And that fits with my overall thesis about Cecco's preference for Arabic sources over Greek sources in his astrological work. But I couldn't find any evidence for the father or the two sons having ever written a text which contains these words. Right? So that text might be lost. Or maybe it was simply that it was never translated into a European language. Maybe it still exists in its original source language, and it's in a library in Baghdad somewhere. Maybe, or maybe Cecco just threw it out there to sort of. And this is one thing that I think he does a lot. He sort of brags about his mastery of the subject a lot, right? And I think we have just a ton of examples of him doing that or like being that way. And so I think he might be like, look at me, I know this amazing ancient forbidden or lost knowledge or this source that you puny students don't have access to, so I know exactly what I'm talking about, right? He has that attitude in the way that he communicates his lectures. So yeah, ultimately I do think he was making some things up. I do think that a lot of the things that he was quoting from may have been from actual sources, but ultimately, yeah, a lot of those sources just don't exist anymore. So, Brian, now that we've established how Cecco thought and wrote, how should people best approach and read an exposition? so that they can appreciate exactly what he's saying. He has a pattern in the manner of his speech and his pedagogy, which often it's often not so subtle, and he doesn't hide this more demonological interpretation within the natural history of Sacrobosco's Disfera very well. Like I said before, he's often not very bashful about it. He just tells you where his source is from. But like I said, he has a very specific manner of approach to his lectures. So yeah, do you have any advice for people who might initially struggle with that?
Yeah. I think it would be a good idea to have a copy of Sacrobosco's text with you while reading Cecco. And De Sfera Mundi, it's actually a very short work. I think it's like around a third the length of Cecco's commentary, which is not super long itself. And you can find English translations of Sacrobosco really easily online. So that way you can see what Sacrobosco was actually talking about in any given passage, which I think will highlight just how much, might say unnecessarily demonological commentary Cecco piles onto it. Um, it it seems clear that he was the kind of person that was just really into this stuff and wanted to talk about it to somebody. Because I don't think anything in a straightforward reading of De Sfera really calls for any of it.
No, it doesn't at all. He is really applying a new layer of interpretation to Dysphera. And yeah, I mean, when I was researching it as well, I was reading. Forgive me, I forget the title. There's like 9 books and they're like 700-800 pages each. The examinations of early modern science and natural philosophy.
Oh, Lynn Thorndike's.
Lynn Thorndike's, thank you. He was on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, I was going through Lynn Thorndike's work, and I was reading while I was researching about Cecco's life and his output. And Lynn Thorndike is incredibly dismissive of Cecco's contribution, despite including it in his overall work. And he makes a point about him not being a very good natural philosopher. And I don't think Cecco's goal was to be a natural philosopher. I think his goal was to communicate this black magic. And I think his students who were attending his class might have quietly known that. I'm not sure. I can't be sure exactly how many times did he teach this class as well. He might have had an alternative class that was, totally licit. And this was an alternative that was the one that got him in trouble, and the one that got the manuscript that was the one that got caught and thankfully ended up surviving because he got caught by the Inquisition, because it was taken in as evidence, right? So
Yeah, I almost get the impression that Cecco kind of had the disposition of what like we might think of in modern times as like a folklorist. Like he because he just there's nothing systematic about his presentation of the necromantic material. It's just every little bit of data about anything remotely related to it that he comes across in his reading, he throws in to his commentary on Sacrobosco.
right, right. And in some cases, like I think it's part 3, chapter the third lecture, is it's the shortest part, and it's almost entirely about astral nigromancy. He makes very little comment elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he really focuses on that one chapter. Like there's bits peppered through, but then part 3 is like intense. But yeah, and then like part 4, I think he goes on to talk about Floron and then the mirror and stuff. But yeah, I think you're right. He was really just trying to get this information out. And yeah, unless we could be flies on the wall, if we ever got a time machine to go back and actually see how this was being presented and to whom specifically, Um, you know, it's really nice to think about, like, or speculate about it all. But yeah, it's really nice that it survived and that we still have access to it. But he was definitely teaching it, and I think he was definitely teaching it with a wink and a nudge, under a cover of respectability, by using Sacrobosco as a sort of a tool in that regard to maintain that level of respectability while he was teaching at university openly black magic. um,
Mm,
but yeah, I think I think I should also add as well that that Cecco, he tends to break things up into, like, while he's actually doing his lessons, he tends to break them up into sets of three, in the way that he explains specific points. So he makes an introduction to a point, and he usually, that's like quoting from the source material, and then he'll give like an astrological interpretation of this this point from his perspective, and then he'll give another interpretation which is nigromantical, and
mhm.
sometimes he can be a little difficult to follow, which is why I think we incorporated so many footnotes that give you the context of what it is exactly that he's saying, so that you understand the theory behind what he's getting at. Um, but once it clicks, I think you can see that what he's doing, and I think you can see exactly what he's doing, and it is sometimes it's incredibly scandalous stuff for the time, and I think his remarks on in particular, his remarks on the inevitability of Christ's crucifixion and the nature of the darkness that fell over the earth after Christ dies, that is particularly interesting, and I think may have been one of the real big issues that got him in so much trouble with the Inquisition, and that is specifically because he makes his argument throughout his lectures. He's presenting what today we would call astrological fatalism, which I'm confident he inherits from his Arab sources. Um, and the Arab sources themselves would have taken their inspiration from the Greek sources, right, which they translated. So it's a through line of pagan thought entering his admittedly Christian uh, worldview, right? The way in which he perceives reality, and it's coloring the way that he's interpreting astronomy and astrology, and then it also interprets the way the way it informs his magic, the magic that he's explaining as well. And this idea of astrological fatalism is is particularly heretical because free will is needed for salvation in the Christian worldview. But if everything that we do is already written by the fates, it's already written in the stars, and this includes the death of Christ and the birth of Christ too, right? He makes a small comment about the birth of Christ, but I think he makes a really big point in his fourth lecture about the death of Christ. If that was fated by the stars itself, and that you could actually pinpoint the exact moment of it, and he makes all these claims that he's done these things, then the astrology that Cecco is presenting is in immediate conflict with Christian orthodoxy.
So on the topic of things that Cecco interpolates into discussion of Sacrobosco, you say in your introduction that Cecco's work, quote, is a vital key to understanding how illicit religious practices, astrology, and philosophy were transmitted from Byzantine Greek and Arabic sources into France, Spain, and Italy in the late Middle Ages, and the profound influence this had on European magical practices. And then again, later on, his work records what was perhaps widely understood by operant necromancers of his day. So, do you think that Cecco's text may be the closest thing that we have to an actual example within a university curriculum of the kind of material that prompted the so-called condemnation of errors related to magic at the University of Paris in 1398? Because there are obvious parallels in the condemnations to elements we see in actual grimoires, but I think we're still lacking any evidence of anything like a grimoire showing up in a classroom, the way that Cecco's lecture did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Yeah. Of course, I'd love to be able to know if there are any other such cases in the historical record of this sort of thing happening. But after all I've read, I can't find anything specific that goes into specifically like demonology in such a highly specific degree. I know that there are other examples of natural philosophers who had written or even tangentially like about the subject of necromancy in their work, right? And of like the aerial domains and aerial demons, like prior to Cecco, because several of these specific people, Cecco himself like quotes from directly, um, and like gets a lot of his inspiration from. But these are Cecco's lecture notes that he used in his classroom and presumably taught multiple times to many students at Bologna University. And as we know, universities were hubs of what we now call the necromantic clerical underground. Yeah, and this
Hmm.
is where people were they're literate and they had access to libraries of material and these inflowing like Greek or Arabic texts that they could translate. And yeah, there was clearly a lot of work being done quietly, privately, behind the scenes, right? And yeah, I'd like to add some context as well because to your question, because the condemnation of errors are fantastic, and if you don't know what they are, you should absolutely go and like search them out. There's a sequence of them as well. It's not just one, but this one in particular, the one that you mentioned from 1398, and this is a list essentially that was published by the University of Paris 71 years after Cecco had been burned alive at the stake by the Inquisition. So it's almost a century after Cecco has passed away, after he's died. And this must have been like a really, essentially, this is a serious problem for the faculty at the University of Paris, right? If they're putting out this list of things not to do in regard to black magic being practiced on campus, right? This is it wasn't one or two instances of this happening. This must have been a serious problem for them to have published this. So because they created this list, and now because we're familiar with it, we know what it is. Like I said, you don't create this set of rules banning these behaviors unless people are actively doing them. The list
Right.
contains like this sequence of 28 errors, which they're commonly believed to be made by those practicing illicit sorcery, black magic, and many of which like they directly mirror aspects of Cecco's lectures, most notably of all being the Article 25, which reads that it reads that one demon is king of the East, and mainly by his merit, another king of the West, another of the North, another of the South. This is an error. So this is a direct reference in this condemnation of errors to the four kings, which is what I'm really interested in this jigsaw puzzle of who these four individuals are and what their position is and what their role is in the history of necromancy or the history of black magic in as practiced in Europe and through the grimoires. So there are multiple other errors which are also pertinent to Cecco's perspective of astrological fatalism and the nature of the spheres of the heavens. So I should underscore that here that neither you or I think that Cecco was the first lecturer to ever teach this sort of thing in a classroom. I mean, we don't have any evidence, but there's no way that we can say that he was the first. Although he
Right.
may have been the first to do so with such brazen arrogance and actual written record. um,
Yeah,
and
you'd think we would have heard of someone else otherwise.
Right, exactly. So I think that Cecco was part of something much more widespread. I think he's one small cog in a much wider uh, a much wider practice that was happening throughout the universities of Europe. I think he's just the one who got caught, or at least he's the one who upset enough people that he was made an example of during his day, right? I mean, we'll get into this later, right? But there's a reason why he was killed. And I think that the condemnation of Paris is just a really good example of this problem almost a century after Cecco, right? Remaining behind the scenes in university settings. And I think back in Cecco's day, it would have been, I think it would have been everywhere. I think many, many, many lecturers across Europe would have been doing this. Cecco's just the one who got caught, I think. Like I said, he was part of something much more widespread. But yeah, thankfully, his work has survived. And we have this window into his work and into the way that he thought, and into, I think what's really important, the influences that were informing his worldview. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm really fascinated in, and that's what I'm really excited to share with everybody. Not just necessarily Cecco's lectures, but the manner in which his thinking was influenced by all of these other pseudepigraphic texts which were flooding the universities, right? And it's that material that I'm really interested in. Like, we could call it proto-grimoiric in a sense. Some of it must have been grimoiric in a sense. But yeah, it's that material that I'm really, really interested in. And we get to see what was being taught in a classroom, which is interesting in and of itself, right? But yeah, finally, even though Cecco was burned alive for his actions, it didn't stop the transmission of this heterodox knowledge being taught at universities. So much of what ends up in the condemnation of Paris, I think, is really important, and it gives us this really interesting window into what was actually being done, right?
Yeah, and to your point about Cecco's relative brazenness in his presentation of this material in a public forum, I can't help but draw a comparison with the kind of parallel situation of Giorgio Anselmi, who we mentioned earlier,
Yes,
who
yes.
was he was another teacher of medical astrology at Bologna. He lived just about a century after Cecco and was writing on very similar topics, yet apparently avoided any kind of censure. And it really does make me think that Cecco's downfall may have been due more to his personality than anything else.
Yeah, there's so much that we could talk about regarding this point. Cecco was unashamedly like arrogant, and perhaps, and I think there's a good point that we can make here. I think he was rather neurospicy. Given that he gave exactly zero fucks about telling people exactly what he thought, often with often with his specifically his astrological work, when he was doing divinations for people, he was quite an accurate in some regards. In some he wasn't, but in some regards he was very accurate with his readings. But unfortunately for him, he was very accurate with the fortunes that he was explaining were very bad for the people who he was reading for. And yeah, apparently this, plus his absolute and utter lack of grace at court, is primarily, I think, the reason that he got himself into a lot of trouble. Adding to this, I think that we get a clearer picture of his this arrogance in his writing, and this arrogance in his way of living his life, specifically in the way that he wrote his lectures, but especially in his actions, the things that we know that he did through history. He is, however, he's clearly enthusiastic about his interest in astrological nigromancy, and this doesn't stop him. He doesn't, even though he knows that he could get into a lot of trouble, he just doesn't stop, right? So we
Mm.
should note that, as you mentioned in your question, and we've talked about this character quite a few times now, but this Giorgio Anselmi, he was doing almost the same kind of magical stuff only a few decades later, and didn't get in any trouble. He probably just kept his head down, and you know he wasn't being such a renegade about the whole thing, right? Or he perhaps he just wasn't being so arrogant about it. He wasn't being so brashful, I think. We also have another really interesting character. We have Antonio del Montolmo,
Hmm.
who was also lecturing at Bologna University, and he published De Occultis et Manifestis, right? And with his own name attached to it, no less. So this is an example of somebody that I think they break new ground. This is the first time in history where we find an author magician, simply because prior to this, the traditional convention was to add the name of a patriarch such as Solomon, Moses, Hermes, or even Adam to a text to give it authority. You remember that what we mentioned before, like the idea of the appeal to authority, right? So Montelmo's writing it's already been translated into English, and you can find it in Claire Fanger's really excellent collection of essays titled "Invoking Angels." Um, and Montelmo, he doesn't even hide what he's doing, and he's even more explicit than Cecco, very explicit, and he doesn't couch it in an interpretation of another text. He just lays it. He lays out his system with his name attached to it. That's pretty brazen, right? And yet he's fine. He doesn't end up getting prosecuted by the Inquisition. He doesn't end up getting burned at the stake. And arguably, he's committing an even greater crime, right? Later on as well, we find the Summa Sacra Magicae, right, collated by Ganelli, another author magician. He doesn't fear putting his own name onto the work. Second time that's ever done, right? And all of these examples, right? These men, they never fell foul of the Inquisition, even though that their work was like explicitly heretical. So the problem with Cecco is that he just makes enemies everywhere that he goes. And I think the final nail in the coffin of his fate was struck after he correctly predicted the turbulent life of the daughter of Duke Charles of Calabria. His prediction was really scandalous, claiming the future queen, Joanna I of Naples, would be of quote unquote disordered lust. And in some real Game of Thrones-esque Italian history, some of which we include in the book because it's really fascinating, she finds herself married off 4 times, with each husband being murdered or assassinated, killed in battle, until she is herself found to be she ends up being excommunicated by Pope Urban VI. And then she is in turn assassinated and buried in a well outside the church of Santa Chiara. So because she had been excommunicated, she wasn't allowed a proper funeral or an actual burial. So they just threw her body in a well. Her history doesn't end there either, right? Because she had no surviving heirs after her death. And this itself leads to decades of recurring wars of succession across Italy. So a really important, famous character in history. And Cecco was in part involved in that story, specifically predicting her life, the outcome of her life. But this prediction did not go down very well with the Duke. And before all of this, Cecco had already been exiled from Bologna University, or from Bologna itself, for teaching astrological nigromancy at university, and he ends up moving to Florence. And then the Inquisition wasn't actually all that fast to follow up with him. And I should add as well, I know that we have a lot of history of the tortures and the horrific things that the Inquisition did, mostly to women, right? Unfortunately, mostly to women. And the sad part of the tale is really, unfortunately, that they didn't necessarily follow up with men that often, or especially learned men as often as they would poor women. And so after he's exiled to Florence, Cecco sort of gets a free pass for a while. But he doesn't, I mean, even though he's banned for life from ever teaching again, or forever doing astrology ever again, or ever for working for a lord ever again, he goes right back to doing all of those things. And not only that, he ends up making all these mistakes again, pissing off all the wrong people again. And yeah, I think this one prediction was the final nail in the coffin, like I said before, of his reputation. And so he seems to have absolutely no concern for his behavior and no remorse for his actions. And yeah, personally, I would probably, yeah, I probably would have felt the same. But the problem is that Cecco immediately goes back to doing all of the same things again, despite his ban from the church. We also know he had a very public rivalry with the Bishop of Aversa, who was the chancellor to the Duke, whom he worked with, who he worked under within his court, and that it was, it would have been a simple task, a really simple task, for this bishop to have just written a little letter to the Inquisition and let them know what was happening. And then the authorities are alerted to his behaviors, and he ends up being burned at the stake in Florence.
Well, I mean, I suppose everybody has to make a living somehow.
Yeah.
Do
I
what you
just think
know.
do what you know. I agree, and that's why I say I would have felt the same as him to a degree. In that, if I'm already skilled in something, I wouldn't want to just quit. And it's something he's passionate about, which is magic and astronomy and astrology. So it's difficult for me to feel like, oh, he was an idiot. It's difficult for me to feel like that, but I can see his arrogance, and just thinking that he could get away with it. And I should add to this point specifically that he had already divined the moment of his own death. So he was so cocksure that he was actually fine. So even when the Inquisition came back for him the second time, he was quietly confident that he would get off with it again. And he would just be like, oh, I'll be exiled again and I'll just have to go find somewhere else to go and work. But he didn't. He actually does catch up with him, and he is executed for it, which is a shame. We shouldn't be executed for having interests like this, but it was a very different era.
So you were the one between the two of us primarily responsible for identifying the many texts and authors that Cecco cites throughout his commentary. Can you talk a bit about how you went about doing that, or what that research process was like?
Yeah, it was slow. It took a long time, but I kind of found a lot of pleasure in it. I really enjoyed doing it. I wanted to not just present his work. I wanted to give a really solid background of his influences, right? So one of the first things that you need to get used to when you're reading medieval natural philosophy is that the author will often assume that their readers are familiar with a lot of texts that were circulating a lot around the time of writing. And the convention is often one of making or bolstering an argument by simply making reference to the title of a book or an incipit, which is just the first line of a text. This is why I wanted to add a lot of more information to the footnotes in this project, and I really wanted to flesh out the cosmological position that Cecco was, the cosmological position that Cecco is inhabiting while he's teaching, right? The world in which he lives in, the world that he's attempting to explain to his students. So I started noting down all of the titles that Cecco drops throughout the lectures, and then I spent time researching them online. And yeah, as Eric Perdue mentioned when I was interviewing him, you'd be amazed by how much that you can find online now. There's a lot of materials have been scanned into libraries, and you can find a lot of things as PDFs, especially through the online archive. I think she's just an absolute wealth of knowledge. So there's so much that you can find online already.
It's always where the first place I start.
Yep, yep. And then, you know, after you've gone through all your sources that you can find online, and that, you know, it can be quite exhausting, you know, going through everything, and you have to be really smart. I did this with you recently, actually. I was searching for a specific text. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact title. And I was searching for it wrong. And you were like, no. You have to search for it under its Latin title, not its English, the translated English title. And you found it for me really quick. So, you know, it's like, yeah, you have to be smart in the way that you search, right? So it's not just put in a title, try and find it on Google. There's a lot more to it. And you know, and it helps to know where to look. So like, yeah, I started off doing that. Once you've exhausted all of that, the thing is then you have to start looking up libraries, right? So a lot of libraries have, a lot of universities, I should say, have their libraries digitized in catalogs, which are usually available online. The problem a lot of the time is that they're only put up in their native tongue. So a lot of these universities here, like one of the ones that we rely on a lot in our book was the Leipzig Codex, I think. So like I use that for appendices 4, where we like go into like a lot of material on the spirit Floron, who is mentioned specifically by Cecco, and I think he's one of the earliest, or if not the earliest, mention of this spirit. So like you go through all these university libraries, and then through those portals you can usually find downloads for texts or manuscripts. But yeah, again, you have to like be able to read the native Latin in some cases. Thank you very much, Brian, for all of your hard work. And
It's what I do.
yeah. So you have to go through all of that, and then on top of that, there's essentially through those libraries you can find metadata, which is really interesting. And that metadata is often like attached to like catalogs of things. So you have to search for things, you know, like dates when things were written, locations where they were written, languages in which they were written in, authors or spurious authors, all those sort of things that you can like start to collate and then like draw from. And yeah, it takes a long time, but I'm the kind of guy that really enjoys doing that sort of thing. So even though I would spend, I'm not joking, like an entire day just trying to find one little line from one text, you know, it was really good fun doing it. I really enjoy it. But yeah, so going through a lot of titles, trying to find all of that information. And then one thing that is often an absolute lifesaver when working with medieval texts is the author will often cite the incipit, which we've mentioned a few times, which is the first line of the text. And that is also often included in metadata, where it gives you that access, right? You can find that incipit, and that allows you to find the text that you're looking for. So a lot of Control F and then searching for specific phrases and going through massive catalogs and downloading PDFs of catalogs and then going through it, you know, line by line to try and find the specific text that you're looking for. And, you know, a lot of the times so that this is really useful because there are a lot of texts and manuals from that period which have like the exact same title as each other. You know, and the only way that you can tell them apart is by the incipit, right? So another primary scholastic convention for the majority of European history is the what we've already mentioned is this appeal to authority, which is where an author makes the case that their position makes a case for their position by saying something to the effect of, the philosopher said so, right? And in this specific, I didn't know this when I started this project, but when a natural philosopher uses this phrase, in this specific case, the philosopher is a specific reference to Aristotle. So whenever you come across that phrase, you know, he means Aristotle. But like to the uninitiated, to people who haven't spent hours and hours and hours working on this, you would never know that, right? So,
Right. It's like, which philosopher?
yeah, exactly. That's how I started. I was like, who? So it helps to read really broadly as well, right? So like if you read a lot of like more university level text, like the above mentioned Routledge, a history of magic and stuff like that, and you read like what a lot of scholars are pointing out, then you can start to piece these bits together, and you can understand things a bit better. But we mentioned this before we started recording as well, like a while ago now. But like we should make a point: neither of us are specifically scholars. We're not like specifically university educated to do this. I am just a really passionate amateur.
Yeah,
So,
same.
um,
I
so
was trained as an archaeologist.
yeah, I was trained as a film production guy, doing green screens and stuff. So this is entirely something that I'm just really passionate about doing. So working on this project and working on projects like this is fascinating to me. It's brilliant because I'm getting an education. I'm educating myself while I'm doing it. So I love it. It's brilliant. But back to your question, the same thing, in regard to like the idea of the philosopher, the same thing happens with Hermes Trismegistus and others of these, the same like mytho-historic individuals, so if we understand these conventions, like it really helps us sift through the material better. There were also a ton of issues that I came up against while doing this. Often, Cecco doesn't cite the incipit accurately, as we've mentioned already, but sometimes he's also like wildly off. So much so that like I think he's probably not really remembering exactly what has been written, or he's misquoting on purpose, like we've already talked about. But yeah, the it often leaves me like, what version of this book are you reading, Cecco? Where are you getting this information from? Other times, like the titles of the books aren't accurate, or they're close to being accurate, but not quite. This often happens with the Greek text that he's citing, but strangely, Cecco is really accurate with his Arabic titles, his Arabic sources. So I build an argument throughout that he is far more interested in his Arabic sources than his Greek. I mean, we know, of course, that the Arabic sources were themselves inspired and translated, translations of Greek material in a lot of material. But I think a lot of these Arabic sources that he was drawing on were uniquely Arabic or uniquely Islamic, and only tangentially like influenced by the Greek sources, right? So, I mean, again, evidence difficult to produce evidence of this specifically, but once you've read through it and you've been immersed in it for so long, you start to get a sense, I think, of where Cecco was coming from. But yes, some of the books that were really low hanging fruit were like Euclid, Virgil, Aristotle, Ibn Sina, Al-Kindi, those sorts of authors. And yet, still the quotes that he cites from these authors they're just off sometimes. And I have these authors on my bookshelf. I can look them up and I can read all the way through them, and I struggle to find exactly where he's specifically quoting from. Other authors were obviously pseudepigraphical, right? So you have to really search for those characters, those individuals, and it's really obscure stuff. So others, well, perhaps Cecco made some of them up, as we've discussed a lot. to kind of just show off or flex to his students, about his access to ancient knowledge. But in other cases, he seems to have an agenda to what he's saying, and that's the agenda that he's getting at is the subtext. I think the subtext that runs through his lectures, and I have my opinions of that, but I'll leave that mainly to our readers to put together for themselves. But yeah, other places I checked were collections of titles from like esoteric libraries, like Skinner and Clark's recently published Antipaulos Maleficorum, which is Trithemius's library. And yeah, obviously that's like centuries after Cecco's writing, but they're really good sources for material because we can kind of see potentially materials that Cecco was reading that went on to develop into those libraries or into books that find their way into libraries like that. So so I originally organized all of this information into pages of tables in one of the appendices of at the back of the book, but our publisher Erze made it quite clear that she really doesn't like tables. So we went with a slightly different format, which Brian, you kindly created for us, and I hope is easily readable and digestible by our readers. But yeah, finally, I collected all of the various quotes from the text that Cecco seems to be most enamored by, and I arranged them into order, like in the order in which that they would have been presented in the texts that he's quoting from, and these just so happen to also be predominantly the texts that we just can't find any longer, right? So, like, my goal here was to attempt to preserve something of these now lost texts that exist within Cecco's lectures. So perhaps in the future, somebody far smarter than me, with perhaps more access to libraries than I'll ever have, could potentially find them, discover them, translate them, and even hopefully one day publish them. That is, unless Cecco wasn't just, making them up.
Well, Matt, I think that was a lot of really good research advice for anyone doing similar types of research as we've been working on.
I
Um,
will add, it will eat your time. So
oh yeah.
time management is very important. Let's just put it this way: I'm very glad that this project is finished now that I have two children.
And something I'll add is do what we did. Reach out to experts. Find people who know about the things that you don't or can do the
Mm.
things that you can't. Um,
Collaboration is the
and
future, 100%.
yeah,
Especially in like fields like this, because like a lot of us have very niche skills. You know, like you're a very good translator of like like Greek, Latin. And you have a very particular set of skills that I just completely lack. And reaching out to people who have those skills that you can marry with your own. Yeah. I mean, otherwise, you might be like, you have to spend a decade or so getting good at that subject to then produce your translation. It can take forever. No, like you said, reach out to people, collaborate. This is a really niche subject, and inside a niche subject itself. So arguably, there's not that many people who are really interested or are passionate about this subject. So if you want your project to become manifest within the world, it really helps to work as a team with people.
well, as we're moving towards wrapping up, I think I did want to. Uh, I thought it might be interesting to give listeners just an example of the kind of things that Cecco actually discusses in his commentary that got him in so much trouble. Um,
Oh, please.
uh, yeah, so here in a passage where he's talking about what are called the couleurs, or what generally today in astronomy are called meridians. Basically, the big circles, like the big imaginary circles projected onto the celestial sphere, which intersect the points of the equinoxes and solstices. So here's what Cecco says. The incubus, according to Hipparchus, is said to linger in the couleur which marks the summer solstice, and these spirits take over the sexual dreams of men and take away their sperm during the greater conjunction, that is, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are conjoined in Cancer or Capricorn, and then discharge it into the womb of some woman, whence people are conceived and born who appear to be divine and who establish laws in the world and perform wonders, as Merlin did, and as will the Antichrist, who will be conceived by a virgin and perform many wonders, of whom I will tell you at the end of this reading. So I think here we see one of the more theologically problematic lines of Cecco's commentary. And it's not because of the talk about demon sex, which I think is actually more or less what orthodoxy maintained, at least at some points. Aquinas makes the same argument in his Summa Theologiae. Um, but actually, the problem is that Cecco appears to be suggesting a simultaneously, as Matt mentioned earlier, astrologically fatalistic and demonological explanation for the advent of the Antichrist. And if you kind of read between the lines, possibly Christ also. Uh, and even an implicit prediction of when that might occur based on the timing of a planetary conjunction. So I think that gives a pretty vivid idea of what the authorities had a problem with.
Yeah, yeah. um, and it sounds strange, but it gets more scandalous at points as well, doesn't it? But yes, predicting the potential birth of the Antichrist with specific details. Yeah, man, like yeah, as I've written here with a big line underneath it. It's an incredibly bombastic claim. But yeah, going to the idea of like Cancer and Capricorn being the locations of aerial demonic forces. In this case, the succubi, like it's a really ancient idea. We mentioned this already. It goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, I think. This idea that like these aerial spirits can steal the sperm of the man. But yeah, one of specifically with Cancer and Capricorn, it's one of those bits of astrological lore which like it survived for millennia. So I was really fascinated by Cecco's medieval nigromantic interpretation of this. It's really great stuff, but because specifically it goes back to ancient Egypt and the gateway points of the underworld, which is really interesting. Like essentially, Cecco's making he's alluding to this in a sense. The gateway of the underworld is opening or could open with this specific conjunction of planets in these signs, and that would be the birth of the Antichrist. But yeah, you're right. Generally speaking, the idea that the demonic forces could steal somebody's seed during the night was a really commonly held belief. So that wouldn't have got him in trouble, right? That was just everybody understood that. I think it's a really interesting point that he makes a comment about Merlin, actually, just as an aside, right? 6th century
Yeah,
Celtic
I
Britain.
I know that I've read legends. I couldn't give you the source right now, but that did claim that Merlin was the offspring of an incubus.
Really? Right.
Yeah,
Cool. But going back to your point about Cecco being a folklorist, this tracks.
right.
This is
Yeah,
why
exactly.
he brings up Merlin. It would have been a myth that would have been circulating around Europe, and he would have been familiar with it, and he would have known that he was a powerful sorcerer who knew these things. So it's really cool when you start to put all these pieces together. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The Antichrist material is 100% where Cecco gets himself into hot water. Some of the statements that he makes in and around this bit that you quoted are really intense. he presents material here which people who are familiar with the aphorisms of the Arbitel might recognize, where each of the 7 ruling spirits are said to reign over so many centuries or something, so many decades of time. And in the modern day, we see like Aleister Crowley, and we see Peter J. Carroll talking about aeonics, like periods of time. Like there is a new age upon us, essentially, the generic theme in occult circles, which I think has roots in the notion that Jesus Christ will return, or like the Antichrist is coming, that sort of subtext that occurs when in Christian liturgy, Christian materials. It's sort of a riff itself on these earlier Greek and Egyptian ideas. But in general, Cecco places these various demonic forces within the colors. As you said before, Brian, these are like the astrological moments of the solstice and the equinoxes. These are the turning points of the seasons, right? And they are still today understood as these magical moments in time, like sorcerous moments in time. And specifically, as Cecco makes a point of earlier in his work, that they are ruled over by the 4 cardinal kings, right? Oriens, Amaimon, Paimon, and Egin. And we find these points being of incredible importance, essentially, throughout sorcerous materials and grimoires as they progress through history, right? So Cecco not only gives us an understanding of how this cosmology functions, but he gives us this host of spirits as well that inhabit it, right? They inhabit the cardinal directions, but they also inhabit moments of time, specifically the moments of the solstice and the equinox, as well as like the northern latitudes. He's very fascinated by which spirits are inhabiting the north and the regions of the North Star, right? So he moves on to talk a lot about Floron in that, and other famous occult authors like Bruno and that they pick up what Cecco puts down, and they continue this tradition, right, of this mirror magic and this specific northern spirit. But we have evidence that the cardinal regents, as I mentioned earlier, inhabit these points. But this is our first example where these specific names, these specific cardinal spirits, are attached to the zodiacal signs in which they inhabit, right? And we will find them later on in Agrippa, specifically in his 3 books of occult philosophy. They don't start in Agrippa's work. They have a far older precedent, centuries, right, earlier, but we just don't have much evidence of it. And as far as I'm aware, I think Cecco is the first instance of this union of these 4 principal spirits and the zodiacal signs, right? Whether or not they are ultimately Arabic in nature, I think is debatable. Right? I'm not sure exactly how that works. I know, for instance, like my work in my prior book, The Hours, we have initially we have our 4 rulers of hell, right? Who are at the very head or at the very bottom, depending on your perspective, of the hierarchy of spirits as found in the Hygromantia, right? And at some point during the transmission from Byzantium to northern Italy, this hierarchy gets split up. There becomes a second strata of it. We end up with Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth becoming a trinity, with Asmodeus becoming separate, and he sort of goes off to found his own stream of the grimoire tradition. And then underneath them, that's where we start to find Oriens, etc., these other 4 spirits. And they take on a subtly different function, right? Specifically astrological. And we can't exactly pinpoint when this begins. But as far as I said before, this is, as far as we're both aware, this might be the very beginning of that tradition. So I'm very interested in pushing that boundary back, though. If we could find more earlier material that Cecco is himself drawing from, I mean, he quotes from this pseudo-Hipparchic book, right, that we've mentioned. He says that he's quoting from this pseudo-Hipparchus. So we know that unless he was making it up entirely, that there was some prior material that he was drawing from that had a Greek origin, supposedly, but was probably being transmitted through an Arabic source. So, uh, how this all ultimately functions, is a mystery. But we can essentially do a form of like archaeology and sort of put these pieces together, which is what I'm really interested in doing. But yeah, ultimately, I think by understanding this, by coming to some kind of understanding of it, and learning about as much as we can of this tradition that sort of formulated this tradition of necromancy, nigromancy, black magic in relation to the stars, at the I want to say like the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. If we can grasp that and understand that better, it will inform what we understand today. And I think that's a really important challenge that we should attempt, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely more work to be done.
Mm. And there is more work to be done, and specifically your work is really important. I think that's a really interesting thing that you're working on. Whether or not you could talk about it, we'll see. But I know David Rankin is also working on something as well that sort of pushes the boundary back a little further. But yeah, it makes me really excited. I'm really excited to share this with you, with everyone who's listening. But yeah, Brian, thank you so much for coming onto the show today to field these questions to me and to let me ask you questions too. Um, it's been really awesome with you working on the book. I really just want to tell you how deeply grateful I am uh, for everything that you've helped me with in the process of producing this book as well, and like bringing Cecco's life and his work to an English speaking audience for the very first time. Like I learned an absolute ton in all our interactions, and I really want to say thank you. But yeah, for people interested in Brian's work, I've created a list of his books and a link to his personal website in the description below. Brian, I know that you have this new project cooking, and we've danced around it a bit. I would love to talk about it if you're up for it. But including that, do you have anything else that you're currently working on right now?
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure working with you over the past, 3 years on this project.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so.
uh, I frankly, I was amazed at the speed at which you were able to come up with the identifying and tracking down all of these obscure allusions that Cecco makes, and making at least plausible guesses at what he might be talking about. So yeah, like we were saying before, collaboration is the key to getting anything like this done in a reasonable amount of time.
Mm, mm, mm.
Um,
Just be willing to sacrifice all your free time.
I didn't have free time anyways.
but I love it. So it's a pleasure. But like, the entire day will just melt away. It'll be like I'll start at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then before I know it's like, oh, it's like 5 o'clock. I should like start cooking dinner. But
Yeah.
I love it. I absolutely love it.
But as to your question, I've recently completed an edition and translation of a title called the Liber Thesolius, which was originally one of the appendix texts of the Liber Razielis, compiled at as we were saying earlier, at the court of Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. And this text deals with two main topics, um, which at first glance may not seem closely related, but there's crossover. And that's the divine names used to command the spirits, which the text sometimes refers to as angels, sometimes as demons, sometimes just as winds, that preside over the different parts of the world, and separately but relatedly, also a procedure for summoning the spirit of a dead person to serve as a familiar, which in I believe appears to be a very early version of some similar operations that we find in much later grimoires, like 16th, 17th century English works. Uh, but anyway, I'm doing what I can right now to get this ready for publication as soon as possible.
I've had the privilege of having a look over it, and I want to say it's fantastic. It's yet another key in the story that predates Ganelli's Summa Sacra Magicae. So this is one of the not necessarily one of Ganelli's sources, but it's something that was being collated prior to the Summa. So it's very important. And as you mentioned before, like, we have this ambiguity, really interesting ambiguity between the types of spirits, the angels, demons, and winds. And I think a lot of people are very interested in that idea of the winds right now, as David Rankin's recent work sort of underscored the importance of the specific strata of spirits in the overall cosmology and how they function. So yeah, exciting, really cool stuff. I'm so glad that you wanted to share some of this information with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty excited about it.
And do you have anything else that you're working on?
Uh, Nothing at the moment that's anywhere near completion.
Brian, thank you so much. Again, I can't thank you enough for helping me and for being my partner as we perform our own act of necromancy in summoning the spirit of Cecco d'Ascoli back into the public sphere, so people can read him and appreciate him once more, and learn a bit more about his life. And give a bit of credit to the guy despite all his many flaws. But Brian, thank you so much. It's been a real honor working with you on this.
Yeah, all I can say is the sentiment is absolutely mutual.
That was Brian Johnson and I discussing our book, An Exposition upon the Sphere of the Cosmos, the Astrological Nigromancy of Cecco d'Ascoli, available now from Hadean Press. I've said this already, but it deserves to be said again. Brian is an absolute legend when it comes to working on translation projects like this. And in the last year, he's put out so much work, with Jose Leto, with Alexander Cummings, and now with me as well. What an honor to participate in this ongoing project of uncovering the hidden aspects of the European grimoire corpus with such amazing people that share my passion. I am forever grateful to everyone who has helped make this book a reality. Brian and I really enjoyed bringing this project to life, and our editors, David Rankin and Erzsébet Barthold, deserve credit as well for all of the hard work that they put in and all of the suggestions they gave us. I'd also really like to thank Sharif Clark for giving me inspiration early on. I'd like to thank Eric Perdue as well for helping me with a couple of astrological obscurities, and to Simone Baldacchi as well for help with Italian poetry and demon lore. Getting this opportunity with Brian to talk about our thoughts and our findings, about Cecco and his lectures was just so much fun, and I think it's safe to say that we both learned a lot from this project. And yeah, I'm really pleased to offer our findings to the community, and I hope that it inspires you as it inspired us. Finally, I'd just like to reiterate that Brian is so correct when he suggests that people reach out and collaborate. These are really wise words. We should be looking to help bring people together, and yeah, the more that we can do that, the better, especially given the state of the world at the moment. But yes, otherwise I remain a tireless champion for Hadean Press and all of their fantastic work that they put out and that they publish. And I hope that we can create more in the future. I'm very happy that this project is finally realised, and I fully intend to continue my work with the Four Kings in earnest. If you have listened this far, then thank you so much. Please comment, share, like, and subscribe for more like this in the future. I have been your host, Mat Hadfield, and I will see you all again in the next one.